everybody, this is Miss Huval. This video is for English 2 Honors, and it covers Chapter 4 of Night. Chapter 4 of Night begins on page 47 and lasts until page 65. This video is not a summary of those pages, it is rather an analysis. So if you haven't read, this isn't going to make much sense. So go ahead and pause me, go read your pages, and come back. Okay, if you're back, I'm assuming that you've read Chapter 4 of Night. Remember, on my JPAMS page, I have posted study guides for you, little note-taking guides. Those could help you get through the chapters and make sure you're understanding the most important things, keeping the characters clear and straight in your head, etc., etc. All right, so this chapter, wow, it's a lot. It's a lot. You start to really see the toll that surviving in a concentration camp takes on a human being. So you think the worst thing that can happen is to die in a concentration camp. And of course that is really bad because there's no chance of being rescued. There's no chance of survival. But also surviving in a concentration camp is a horrible process, and you see things and you experience things that are really soul crushing. So let's talk about the time period the time that's spanned in this particular chapter, where they are specifically, the setting, in time and place. So they're in Buna. Buna is a work camp, and they leave Buna to go to these factories to work. Okay, so they leave the gates and they march to these factories, which are off-site. All right, but they're in Buna, and Buna is of course a part of the Auschwitz compound. I would think that the events that take place here are roughly a few months. As I've told you before, I think the whole book takes place in slightly less than 1 year. So this time at Buna spans, I would say, the bulk of that time. All right? You might have noticed in this chapter, it's a little bit of a different style of storytelling. It's not as much chronological as it is a series of vignettes. And I don't know if you know that word, but vignettes are just little, kind of like anecdotes, little side stories, and they're all together present a really accurate portrayal of what his life was like at that time through these little stories that he emphasizes. And the cast of characters involved in these stories are really interesting. They're very varied. They come from different backgrounds, from different ways of life. Not all of them are Jews. Not all of them are from Germany or Poland. For example, we have Yossi and Tibi, who were the brothers whose parents were killed in Birkenau. They are from Czechoslovakia, and they are Jews. There's Louis and Juliet. They were musicians, and if you remember Alina's dad, Get In with a Commando, that includes the camp musicians who play as everyone marches from place to place. Louis is from Holland, whereas Juliet is, I believe, Polish. Now they are Jews, so all four of these are Jews. And if you remember, Louis was the one that was appalled and disgusted because he wasn't allowed to play Beethoven. Jews were not permitted in the camp to play German composers. And also, there's Frantic and Edek. These are characters who are in the leadership of the camp. Frantic is their work commando leader, and Edek is in control of the factory, where they sort screws and nuts and bolts and things like that. Edek is kind of the one who's crazy and goes off on people and beats the stew out of them. Frantic is the Polish guy who is their immediate supervisor. And sometimes he's nice, sometimes not so nice. All right, so we've got all these kind of people who who may or may not be Jewish. And then also at the factory, we have these French and Polish civilians who are non-Jews, but who are still in these forced labor. They're called forced labor inmates. Okay, so they are political prisoners. They're people who were just put in the work camp because they were moved out of the area that they lived in when that became Nazi-occupied territory, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the sorts of people he's encountering at the camp. A very wide variety of people from very different backgrounds. All right, now something that might be throwing off your groove could be the hierarchy of how these people are organized in the camp. All right, so I looked this up to try to get a little bit of a better grip on it. All right, we hear a lot of people referred to as capos. There's the Obercapo, the Lagercapo, and the capos mostly worked in work administration. In other words, getting people to do the jobs that they were assigned to do, organizing those jobs, et cetera, et cetera. The Obercapo would be an overseer, and the camp leader would be the Lagercapo. All right? Now, you got people called the Blockel test and the Lagerl test, and I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but I'm doing my best. This little ending on this word means elder, and these people would have been in camp administration. So not in as much on the work part of it, but as the organizing and executing how the camp run. The roll calls, the feeding of people, the selections, stuff like that. And we haven't even really got to any selections yet. So that's the hierarchy. I thought you might find that interesting. And sometimes people are called an Obercapo, like the guy who was hung, the Dutch Obercapo. And the Lagerl test and the Lagercapo were the inmates who were in charge of putting together those executions and making them happen. And if you remember the first execution, the first round of executions where the one young man was hung, the Lagerl test and the Lagercapo did perform that execution, hung him, okay? But the second execution, when it was the Dutch Obercapo and the young Pippel and the other guy, they refused to have any part of it. And so SS men actually carried that out, not the inmates. So we'll talk about that a little more, but I just thought you would be interested to understand that hierarchy of how the inmates were utilized, and we've talked about that before, the inmates utilized to maintain order in the camps. Yeah, and what did they get in exchange for that? Protection for their family members, extra rations, health care, stuff like that. All right, so as we look at our theme development, I want to talk about how the Nazis go about breaking down the Jews. How do they go about really attacking their humanity, okay? And all of the different themes sort of feed into this theme. When we look at their faith in God, when we look at their family dynamics, all of these things kind of come back to their humanity, okay? So the importance of maintaining human dignity in the face of inhumanity and degrading circumstances. So how does this theme develop in this particular chapter? How does it come about? All right? So what happens, and the way Elie Wiesel sort of brings it to the forefront, is they face inhuman treatment. And we're going to talk about some specific examples of that. And they do one of two things. And sometimes they do one, and sometimes they do the other. They cling to human dignity, and they lose human dignity. And that's how that theme develops. Okay, that's a very important thing in literature for you to learn how to do. Not only identify a theme, but then once it's identified, trace its development. Okay? So let's look at some ways that the Jews in this particular chapter face inhumane treatment. And the examples abound. I'm pretty sure that you noticed at the very beginning of the chapter, page 47 and 48, Ailey tells us that when they first arrived, some of the young boys, some of the young kids were treated with kindness, okay, by some of the officers. And then he goes on to say that there was there was trafficking in young boys by pedophiles in many of these camps. Ailey says he came to find that out later. So that's one way that the Jews faced inhumane treatment, a way that we might not typically associate with a concentration camp. Mostly we think of the threat of death, which is always there. There are always SS men there with rifles, just waiting for you to take a wrong step. Think of the guy who gets the sip of the soup, right, as that cauldron's left out during the American air raid. He can't resist. He climbs up to it, and they let him get all the way up there and stick his head in, and then they shoot him. So you're always in peril. You're always in mortal danger. But there are other ways that you're broken down. There are other ways that you are mentally tortured and physically tortured. Okay, we talked about Edek a little bit. Edek is the guy who runs the work commando at the factory. And he flies off the handle, and he does crazy things. And he just beats Ailey for no reason. He starts out on page 53. He also, at one point, beats Ailey's father for no good reason. He's not working fast enough. He's not working good enough. And at that stage of the game, we find that causes Ailey's dad, his human dignity, to suffer. And then it has a negative impact on Ailey as well, because Ailey makes the comment that it's not like when the first guy beat his dad, when he had the colic attack. In this instance, he's angry with his dad for aggravating Edek. Why can't he just do his job? Why can't he just be quiet and avoid this situation happening to him? This is his fault. Rather than blaming Edek and wanting to beat up Edek, he blames his father. So you see how that breakdown in the family unit theme kind of goes hand in hand with this debasing of our basic humanity. So there's the attack by Edek. There is this whole idea, and this is a big one in this chapter. There's this whole idea that no matter what you do, no matter how you scheme, no matter what plans you make, it seems as though they all go up in smoke. And there's no way to strategize to be successful in this concentration camp. Think about just something as simple as his shoes. On page 48, he's deciding what work commando he should go into. Ailey is. And this guy says, well, I can make sure you get with your father. All you have to do is give me your shoes. And he says, no, I'm not going to give you my shoes. These are good shoes. And he says, so, that opportunity passed for me to get something in exchange for my shoes. And later, they were taken away from me, and I got nothing in return. So the shoes are a good example of that. Ailey's teeth, if you remember the whole thing with him having the gold crowns in his mouth. He was marked down at the initial medical inspection, which was not a medical inspection in the usual sense of the word, to see if you were healthy. It was to see what you had in your mouth that could be of use to the Nazi war effort. So Ailey had these gold crowns, and he was called to the dentist. Well, you remember what happened with that. Ultimately, the dentist did not get the tooth because he was hanged before he could. And the reason he was hung, if you remember, is that he was taking the gold crowns and using them for himself, like trading them for, food or whatever. So the dentist doesn't get the tooth. So he wins that little victory, and he's happy about it because he says, oh my gosh, I hung on to my tooth. Maybe at some later point it'll come in handy. And that happens on page 51 and 52, the whole episode with the dentist. Ultimately, though, he loses that tooth. And he loses the tooth to Franek, the Polish guy, who is the guy who is the leader of their commando. Okay? And he notices the tooth. And then he starts to pick on Ailey's dad until Ailey can't take it anymore. And he lets him have the tooth. If you remember, that happens about 54. Franek is beating his dad because Ailey's father is not good at marching in time. And it gets taken out with a rusty spoon. And then Franek stops abusing his father. So he won that little battle. And then ultimately, Franek is moved to another concentration camp with a group of Polish people. And after all that, he had won this safe position with Franek. And even that was for nothing, because Franek was moved to a different concentration camp with a group of Polish people. So this whole idea that you can scheme and you can do this and you can make decisions and you can think about what you should do, Ailey and his dad fretted over that decision of letting Franek have the tooth. And as it works out, nothing you do makes a difference in the end. Nothing brings about a real positive change. And that, after a while, can break you down. Really can break you down. And make you feel hopeless. And like nothing you do makes a difference. Guys, I'm going to stop this video right here. And I'm going to make a part 2 video. So be sure you look for part 2 of chapter 4 of Night. And when I come back, we won't have much to finish up. Thanks, guys. See you in a bit.